Friends, welcome to the Words of Wisdom Gyan Ganga show of Virat Hindustan Sangam. And today we have a special show on Ghar Wapsi for British Hindus, if or when. And on this show, we have Dr. Subramaniam Swami and we have Pandit Satish Sharma from London. And he's joining us live. And Dr. Swami and Satish Sharma will be discussing the issues of the uh, British scene, the country
Yeah,
there, and political thing.
overseas Indians in Britain. Yeah,
Overseas Indians in Britain. Over to Dr. Swami for the opening remarks.
yeah. Well, thank you very much. I'm hoping to see Satish Sharma on the screen very soon. I also like to say that Satish Sharma is part of our VHS team in UK. Am I right, Jagdish?
Yes, Dr.
Well,
Swami. It's our UK team of Virat Hindustan Sangam.
that's right. And he is very, very popular. He's highly regarded by the Conservative Party. He has access to all the ministers, their policy making. He's very clear about, and he in fact arranged a meeting of mine on the in the Westminster in the Parliament building, which is a prestigious thing, and one of the senior most MPs of then Conservative Party had presided over the meeting also, and we had therefore he is now regarded as the Indian face in England, and he performed a miracle in the sense due to his campaigning, a lot of Indians who would normally vote Labour saw the Labour program and the way Satish Sharma presented, and they then switched. And many people think that that made the difference, and that's why British Labour Party has now switched its stand on Kashmir and now is taking a more pro-Indian stand because of the defeat they got in the election. So today the topic that he and I are going to discuss is the overseas Indians, particularly in England. I mean, since he's lived in England for a long time, and therefore, but on the other hand, it's a general topic that we have about 30 million Hindus all over the world, and in several countries, a very large number of countries, even small countries which you would never expect, and far away Trinidad and Guyana and so on. These Indians went in several phases. The British took them as labor, and after that our people went as clerks, and then soon their second generation bloomed into businessmen, into scholars, and so on. So today the Indian community is well-to-do, and it has a lot of say in the political process in all these countries. Britain is an issue which Satish Sharma is familiar with, and I think before he comes, I'd like to say something about it because I've been on programs arranged by him several times to Britain. Of course, I'm very familiar with the Indian situations, the Hindus in the United States and Canada, and places like Thailand and Hong Kong. So there is now a very critical point with India becoming a candidate for global power status. Not globalization. I'm not talking about globalization. I'm talking about global power status. And in that, we need a lot of people who are able to bring about innovations, innovational changes, and upgrade our technology. The Indians already have now, the Hindu community in particular, has made huge contributions in terms of remittances. And it's a second most profitable route for us. And so all that they got from India in education and went abroad, they have more than made up for it by the repetition that they've been sending consistently for the last 40 years. So the question now is coming that should they, Hindus in particular, in view of the fact that the world is getting very polarized, and in Britain, for example, the Islamic forces are making life difficult for everybody. Europe now, countries like Poland and Hungary have very frankly said, we will not allow any Muslim immigrant anymore, Islamic immigrant anymore, because they'll not fit into our society. The same view is not legally taken, and as unlike Poland and Hungary, but Germany has taken the stand that stand that we are reviewing the matter, whether it is appropriate to allow a large Muslim influx into Germany. So Britain also, the issue is undercurrent. They are not, British are very low key status, low key in stating something, but the London Bear is now a Muslim, and there are very important people in very high places, and it's unfair to lump everybody into a community hype. But the fact is that the masjids in these countries have become a center place for advocating of radical ideas. And the love jihad is also spread the world over, which is causing a lot of anguish in the original societies. So the Hindus are raising this question: do we continue to stay here? Because now generations educated in these countries are, because we don't have a way of propagating our culture abroad, so they are getting extremely locally, into assimilated, and this means that the Indian community itself would, over the period, would dissolve because they would become indistinguishable. Yes, welcome to Satish Sharma. They would get, integrated with the local society, and this problem is there in the United States also. But more important is that India now, for this big push, needs these Indians who are in such critical areas of technological advancement. We have in our panel itself these two gentlemen, one Satish Sharma and the other is Ramesh, and both are in their respective areas in the forefront. So whether India, which is short of such people, should try to woo them back. Of course, India has always been, never broke its umbilical cords with the Indians overseas. When in East Asia, East Africa, when with the Idi Amin and then Jomo Kenyatta, the Indians, after years of staying there, born there, brought up there, they were all asked to leave the country. And that time they had British passports, and the British declined to take them, saying that we won't be able to assimilate such a large number. At that time, Indian doors were open. Even today, when this on this corona matter, coronavirus issue, you find that everybody abroad, they want now to return to India, and they don't want to live in those circumstances of the lockdown in these countries. So Bharat Mata is now a genuine appeal to a lot of these people. So the question is, how is it being agonized? And for that, we have got Satish Sharma here on in the thing. I don't know, his picture seems to have gone. Is he still with us, or has he gone?
No, Dr. Swami is there. We had some technical problems, but Satish
Ah,
Sharma is there.
but his
Uh,
voice is available.
yes, his voice is
Can you,
available.
so,
Satish, you can unmute yourself before you speak.
can
In
I
the
say
bottom,
over to
you can
Satish Sharma
unmute yourself.
now?
At the bottom, there'll be 3 buttons. Click on the microphone to unmute yourself.
Dr.
Please, thank
Swami.
you.
Satishji, you'll have to unmute the mic button, which is on the center bottom of
Hello?
the. You are right.
Am I
Satish,
online?
yeah.
Okay, and Dr. Swamiji.
Apologies to our viewers for some technical problems, but Satish Sharma ji is on the line.
Your voice is available. Yeah, that's good enough. Please speak.
Pranamji and Namaskar ji. It's a pleasure to be here, and my apologies for the minor technical hitch in the connection there. The subject, I presume you've had a quick preamble on, and I'm grateful for the introduction. This issue about Gadwapsi is something which only perhaps a short while ago would have been unthinkable. Nobody would have thought that NRIs in overseas countries, not just Britain but elsewhere, would even consider coming back. The gulf was too great. The comfortable jail that we were all living in was so comfortable, nobody was even considering broader issues. I think the remarkable thing is that the change has occurred within the last 3 to 5 years, and it's been quite a dramatic change. I suspect that what I'm going to be sharing with you is possibly still a little bit ahead of the curve, and the majority of our community are still engaged in what they do so best, which is building a society. But it would be a good time to put it out there. Let's see whether we can start a debate and a dialogue on this very, very important issue. So what I'd like to do is just lay out an argument first, and then perhaps we can have the other participants try and defeat my argument, disconnect all of the bits and pieces, and prove to me that the picture I'm painting is perhaps just in my imagination. It would be wonderful if that could be done. So here are the ideas. I think before I jump in, there are going to be words that I'm going to say, and I'd like to define them to prevent any misunderstanding. The first is whenever I refer to British and Britishness. Will Durant, an American philosopher, he made a remark once. He said that the Englishmen I honor equal to and perhaps above all men, but the British are the worst of all imperialists. So he drew a remarkable distinction at that time, and that was that the indigenous people of these islands, the English, the Scottish, the Welsh, the Irish, they're all wonderful people. But the British identity is the imperial identity. And so when I refer to British and Britishness, etc., it is specifically that imperial identity that I'm referring to. So this, having set the ground rules, there are two other terms I'm going to introduce. One is WAME, W-A-M-E. Now, it's quite commonplace in the West amongst the nations of the European Christians to refer to BAME, B-A-M-E. And what they do, that means black and minority ethnic. So 2/3 of the world's population is bundled together as black and minority ethnic. We want to introduce a slightly different understanding, that is white and majority ethnic. So that when we're engaging in this dialogue with the members of the domestic British community, we're going to refer to them as WAMEs. They have a particular identity as well, which is when they are in power. And so we now refer to them as white and dominant ethnicity. So they are now the Wades, okay? They're the WAMEs and the Wades, and we are all lumped together in the BAMEs. I've used these terms once or twice, and for the first time the response was, it's racist to say white, until we mentioned, well, actually black and minority ethnic is exactly the same thing. Perhaps the shoe being on the other foot isn't quite so comfortable. So Wade and WAME are terms I'm going to be using. So here in the UK, we've been here for over 70 years, I think, before when the first Indians arrived here, and we've had successive waves. And as a community, we are held up as the poster child of integration, that we have assimilated into the British community like sugar in milk, as the proverbial Parsi example is often used. But the interesting thing is that we have done that without knowing the rules, we have done that without knowing the legislation, but it's because we adhere to a higher worldview. And so we fit in everywhere because we have a slightly different way of looking at things, slightly different to the West. But we have assimilated in this country, and we are very, very prominent. As 2% of the population, it's commonly touted that we generate some 6% of GDP. And so if everybody were to follow our principles, the British economy would perhaps increase by, what, 300%? It would be a dramatic leap. So we are acknowledged as being quite a significant part of the community, and regularly we are, a gratitude is expressed for that particular statistic. We've settled in. Up until probably 2013, was the first time that something happened which caused us to reflect. And at that time, as you remember, Dr. Somji, you came all the way to London very kindly to support us in a challenge to the caste legislation. Now that date will go down in history because that was the first time I think many of us felt that we were not British. To be British means that you are protected by all the legislation, you're protected by the systems, the human rights, you are treated with equality. But that legislation, which came from the establishment and was approved by all members of the establishment without any evidence, suddenly reminded us, hang on a moment, perhaps our vision of who we are and where we are is different to the reality. And some of us who noticed this, we started to do more research, we started to explore the reality of these relationships. Now, in this period of lockdown, I've had one or two interesting revelations. One is we have a common phrase where we say, Jaisi drishti, vaisi srishti, that as your vision, so you see the world. Now, if your vision is a dharmic Hindu vision, then you see the world with that lens. And so often you do not have the lens with the focal point to recognize those who see you in an unpleasant manner. And this is a fundamental problem I've discovered for our community. We have made an art, a skill of not noticing the reality when it conflicts with our view how the world should be. The other phrase that I've been mulling and toying with is from the Rig Veda, where we have the wonderful mantra Asatoma Sat Gamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya. And that means that we have to learn to see the reality. May we move from the delusion to seeing what's real. And so the British Indian Hindu community is on this journey now of going from this understanding of what is real towards what is real, from the illusion of being the British Hindu. Now, this journey, some of us are exchanging ideas and fertilizing each other's understandings, and that's now beginning to bear some quite interesting fruit. And here are some of the things that I'd like to share. Bearing in mind that our dear friend Will Durant separated the English from the British, we've discovered that in this country there is the population, which is the English, Irish, Welsh, and Scots. And I grew up amongst the English, and I totally agree that what Will Durant had said about them being incredibly honorable, solid people, that's absolutely true. And it occurred to me that I hadn't encountered a British person until I actually came down to London. I grew up in the Midlands. I'm still called a Pendu by many of my London friends. But it wasn't until I came to London that I started to encounter the British. And this encounter with the British has now crystallized and I can see them quite clearly. So let me share with you who the British are and the problem that we are now beginning to see manifest. So the British are very much the establishment, and that has a number of faces. So if I can share with you the idea that the government is actually British, but even more than the government, because governments come and go, even more than the government, the civil service is deeply institutionally British, and it still has the momentum which was created by the seeds of colonialism. Those seeds we found are within the judiciary, and you may have heard this news. I think we shared it a while ago with the VHS team. We've also had very recently the Church of England, led by Archbishop Justin Welby, made a public statement in which Archbishop Welby announced that the Church of England is deeply institutionally racist. Now, that is an incredible statement to have made. And I really feel sympathy for the despair that he must feel, that this is the institution which has been guiding the morality. It's been the dictator of the moral compass of the nation for so many years, ever since Henry VIII wanted to remarry. And yet they have, in all of that time, not been able to transcend this white supremacist identity. Very much a British identity. One interesting aside there is the use of the word racist. From a dharmic point of view, the concept of multiple races doesn't have a basis in reality, because we say there is the human race. And, Vasudeva Kutumbakam is the notion that all of us share one racial identity. But what we do recognize is sometimes that what they refer to as races should simply be translated into white supremacist, brown supremacist, green, yellow, pink, whatever supremacist. And so the church's statement is actually saying that as the Church of England, we are deeply institutionally white supremacist. Now, if you think about this institution, it permeates every single corridor of power. It's present in the judiciary. It's influencing the House of Lords. In the House of Lords, there are 23 bishops, seats reserved for members of this institution, the head of which has declared they are unable to move beyond their racism. So the church, which is the religious guide, is in fact also a part of this British identity. And I'd go as far as to say that the church is actually the custodian of this British identity. It's been translating, transporting, exporting this identity throughout the globe. And it is clearly a British colonialist identity. If we go beyond that, we've had numerous encounters with the BBC over the years. Many times have many members of the British Hindu community, the British Indian community, objected to the manner in which the BBC portrays India, portrays Hindus continuously, and portrays members of any government which is a Hindu-centric government in such a negative light. It is blatant, and yet they shrug it off. So the BBC, we've now got engagement going, and they too have been proven to be British in the original sense of the word. It's difficult to refute the allegation that the British Broadcasting Corporation was created to spread the British identity to every corner of the globe and to establish this hierarchy. That was its purpose. Some people are now also saying that actually one of the purposes of the BBC was to cover up the fact that most of the world where the British Empire ruled is pretty much a human rights crime scene. And the BBC's job was to make sure that that crime scene was covered up to the best of its ability. And it's been doing that very well. So all of those, the judiciary, the media through the BBC, the civil service, and indeed the religious guides in this country, they are all very much anti-Hindu, anti-India by nature. They are the colonial British identity. So this is becoming apparent to more and more people. And as a community, living in silos, we've actually done very well. We have worked internally, we have worked in an introverted fashion, but as we've expanded, as we've become established, we've now come to the point where impinging upon all of these institutions and their identity. And the British identity and the Hindu identity are diametrically opposite identities. I laughingly use the handle the British Hindu and as my Twitter handle, and often I mull over the notion that the Gita starts with Dharmakshetra, Kurukshetra, and we have the Hindus who are protecting Dharmakshetra, and we have the British who are a great representation of the Kurukshetra, and yet combined, I have a Mahabharata waging within my own mind. But that's been an incredible source of revelations. So these four are now becoming problematical for us. And from one point of view, they need to change and update and upgrade themselves to have connections with a future, a world which is post-colonial and post-theocratic. But they're established to work to prevent anybody discovering that their identity, the British identity, is actually it's an ahankar-based identity as opposed to a sanskar-based identity. It's an identity which has been created to, one, dominate, and then to conceal what was done in order to dominate. Will they be able to make this shift, to leave their inglorious past and to transform and mature and crack out of this British identity to embrace a more humble but a more real engagement with the outer world, is the question that needs to be asked. And I think there are few in the British establishment who realize that this is the reality that they faced. One of the dimensions that I've noticed is that we are in this country a population, the English, Welsh, Scottish and Irish population have been deprived of access to the real history of the British when the British went overseas. So the domestic population have no idea of what was done in their name and supposedly on their behalf. And the Indian population here are equally uninformed. And so when we have members of the political class not aware of the historical context of many of the decisions that they're making, the decisions that they make and the remarks that they make, the statements that they make, are singularly uninformed. And this is quite a significant problem. When Dr. Liam Fox for the Conservative Party announced that Britain post-Brexit would embark upon Empire 2.0, he actually meant it as a good thing, that they were going to do good things in the world. But most of the world outside suddenly thought, oh my God, no, not again. And so there is such a need for the history of what this nation did outside of these island waters to be taught to the occupants of this island nation. And there is a huge need for those who were on the receiving end to start to articulate their experience of engaging with the British. And this is not going to be a comfortable exchange. I don't think it's possible for Britain to step forward into the 21st century without it actually addressing and coming to terms with its history, and where it's necessary, acknowledging that reparations, whether they're moral or whether they are financial or whether they are commercial or whether they are legal, reparations must really be acknowledged and accommodated. And we've started this dialogue with them. Please, G.
Yeah. Well, if you're finished, that is. I mean,
well, I've got one or two. I've only got one or two extra dimensions.
Yeah. Please go ahead. Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Thank you. One of those is that this British establishment that I refer to, they are the people who created Pakistan. So we have a colonial power which was determined to ensure that India remained subdued and never stood up enough to be able to articulate the horrors of what had been perpetrated upon them, giving birth to Pakistan. And the similarity between father and son is something that is unavoidable. Now, when you think about it, I'm going to use the BBC's vocabulary here now. So I live in a country, the United Kingdom, where we have British occupied Ireland, we have British occupied Wales, and we have British occupied Scotland. And they gave birth to Pakistan, which is in fact Pakistan occupied Gilgit, Pakistan occupied Balochistan, and Pakistan occupied Kashmir. There is a remarkable father-son relationship there. And since both of them were created on a negative, it's impossible for a negative ideology to sustain itself over a long period of time. And as we see the Pakistani identity now beginning to fragment, I've heard some delightful statements coming out of Balochistan and Gilgit now, and the weather reports were a pleasure to hear, the Doordarshan weather reports. And similarly here in the UK, we have the devolved nations, as they're called, especially Scotland, leading the charge to say, we've had enough of this Britishness, we want to go back to being Scottish. So there is a parallel decolonizing going on both sides of the world. Now, what this does mean, though, is that because Britain gave rise to Pakistan and created Pakistan, then Britain's loyalty has always actually been to Pakistan. It's always played a double-handed sort of a game. It's spoken nicely and lovingly to India whilst depleting resources and denying natural organic evolution. But Pakistan has a terrible profile, and yet Britain's relationship with Pakistan has always been very, very amicable. We know that we've had a loss of 24% of minorities down to less than 1%, and the atrocities that are perpetrated in Balochistan and the Gilgit area, and Sindh as well. Very recently, I've been getting terrible reports out of Sindh. These are all horrific, and they are much, much worse than, for example, Mugabe's regime in Zambia. But the British vilified Mugabe to the ends of the earth, and yet the royal heir to the throne, Prince William and his consort, the future queen, they visited Pakistan only a short while ago. And that's a seal of approval. So this British-Pakistani relationship is actually going to become, I think, harder and harder to maintain. The British are going to need to face the fact, do we choose Pakistan? Do we choose India? Because the Indians are realizing that you cannot have a symbiotic relationship with a parasite. It doesn't work. No matter how you pretend that the parasite is a symbiote, it isn't, and its nature cannot change. And so this is something that we have to recognize. But the tensions that this British, Pakistan, India triangle have been experiencing over the last 40, 50, 60 years, those tensions are now being played out on the streets of London. And we only yesterday, we had a remarkable development, and that was, for example, 100 mosques, which are all charitable institutions and denied the right and the opportunity to engage in political interference. 100 mosques have written to the new chair and leader of the Labour Party saying that unless you support the Pakistani position, we on bloc are going to move our vote bank away from you. Now, this is an incredible development. One, I've spoken to many Labour friends and who are not of an Indian origin. They're British Labour socialist people who want a socialist Britain with everything that entails. And they're actually horrified that such a bloc would say that our relationship with a nation 6,000 years away, 6,000 miles away, is more important than the security of children, the welfare of people in this country, the economics, the law and order situation, everything else that the Labour Party stands for. None of it is important as compared to this one priority. And that is such a stark development. Personally, I think they have alienated themselves from the vast majority of the British Labour voting public. And this is another step away. The first step we saw when the Pakistani community, supported by Labour parliamentarians, were actually burning an effigy of Modi on the streets of London. And again, the British community thought, this is not some third world. What has happened here? This doesn't happen on the streets of London. So this process is now an ongoing process. And I think what we're going to see is the choice, a very uncomfortable choice that the Labour Socialist Party is going to have to make. And yet the beginnings are there. We are hearing rumbles that outreach is beginning to happen. And I don't think it's possible for a Britain post-Brexit to thrive without a strong relationship with other democratic countries, and countries like India with the benefit of 17,000 years plus of continuous civilization. We have an enormous amount to offer. And one thing that's happening now, I think in the past, we thought our need to offer this in the UK was optional. But what's happened now is more and more Hindus in the British Hindu community are recognizing that our need to contribute this is no longer optional. We have a responsibility and a duty to step up and contribute towards the needs of this country here as well. So that's also happening. Now, if those factors don't come together in a positive manner, then the British community will see an increase in the tensions on all of those boundaries with the institutions, but also with members of other minority communities. And we saw the first signs of this in the run-up to the election, where we had open declarations in the Labour Party conferences which were anti-Hindu, and yet the Labour Party wouldn't even engage with us. These are signs that, hang on a moment, we're possibly not being treated as equals in this country. The other thing that became apparent is that there was so much tension in the run-up to the election. The Jewish community, who are a bit of a canary in the mine when it comes to safety and security of minorities, many of them, several of my good friends and many others had declared that if the Labour Party came in, the security situation would have deteriorated so much. They felt that the Labour Party had been penetrated by Islamists to such a degree that they would leave this country. Now, this happened, and the Jewish community left the United Kingdom, I think, in 1028 AD. So over 1,000 years ago, they also had to flee because of a lack of personal safety. And they were announcing this openly. And there were members of our community who were also saying, we don't feel safe because of the noises that are coming out of the Labour Party. This was unheard of, and yet people were making adjustments. Now, if that, coupled with the 2 or 3 dimensions I've mentioned about the British establishment, if their choices are anti-India, anti-Hindu, and they still maintain that bumbling British colonialist overpromise, underdeliver sort of attitude that they've had around the world for such a long period of time, then there is a very distinct possibility that our security situation in this country will deteriorate. And that, I think, is the first sign where we will see our Sanatani saying, we are not safe here. Now, this is not new to us. If you remember, in 1990, we had the Kashmiris, Hindus who had to leave. There was an exodus out of Kashmir, the seventh exodus. In 68 and 72, we had the diaspora community having to flee Uganda and Kenya. We've now currently got an exodus underway from Pakistan, and the CAA hopefully will help to ameliorate that, and Bangladesh also. We had, as you well know, the departure from Ceylon. So exoduses for Hindus is not something that is alien to us. But I think the exodus from the United Kingdom is something that can be prevented. But it is definitely something now that we should be allowing for and taking into consideration, unless people like Keir Starmer and wiser heads realize that we need to make this change. So this is my proposition, that the pieces of the jigsaw can fall in two different ways. One, we will continue to be prosperous and contribute here, or secondly, in a very, very short space of time, because normally these things happen so quickly, what used to be the unthinkable, and for most people is now the unspeakable, will suddenly have happened, and people will be sitting back thinking that's unbelievable, in the same way that it's happened in so many exoduses. So I would like to present this as a talking point, and hopefully people can add to it and contribute their own ideas, and perhaps do their own research and join into the debate. So, Dr. Thank you.
Let me ask you some questions.
Indeed, please.
This 100 mosques decided, I'll ask the questions and then you can answer after you hear all my questions.
Okay.
This 100 mosques resolution was an outcome of the fact that a Labour Party new leadership following their defeat in the last elections became moderate on the question of Kashmir and so on, and began speaking of Kashmir in more conciliatory terms as far as India was concerned. And appalled by those statements, this statement was made. But I feel that the Muslims also who are taking this kind of line have very little option, because the Conservative Party has no place for them. And if the Labour also abandons them, in fact, it is they who would probably have to think in terms of migration. Second is that there have been, at least in terms of appearances, a great deal of increase in Indians playing a role in the power structure of Britain. They have become ministers. I believe your Home Minister is an Indian, and your Chancellor of Exchequer is an Indian. And there are Indians in many, many key places. Large number of Indians have become members of Parliament, large numbers in proportion to their size. So do you think that if your understanding and the relations with the British as opposed to the English, they also perceive the threat that the Islamic militancy might impose on Britain, come together, that India could be a partner in the power structure of Britain? Or do you think that it is all sliding towards the situation that happened in East Africa?
Wonderful questions, and as I shouldn't be surprised, you hit the nail on the head with both. Okay, so in response to your first question, the appearance of a new leader for the Labour Party is definitely, it's trumpeted a seismic shift. If we have a look at the comments that were made at the Labour conference, and then you listen to Keir Starmer's statements that the issue of Kashmir is actually an issue to be decided by India and Pakistan. Now, in the past, Labour has said, no, we must internationalize this, and we must also get our oar in there, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do that. And so that statement, which says that we're actually effectively publicly going to withdraw from this issue because it's not one in which we have a locus standi or a positive contribution to make. That is a big shift. Now, that shift has been detected and noted, and we have in the United Kingdom an umbrella organization called the MCB, the Muslim Council of Britain. Now, I would say on record that there is a huge number of our friends in the Muslim community who do not accept that they are a representative voice. Having said that, they're the organization who coordinated this 100 mosques letter, which then went off. But as I mentioned, I think that they have shot themselves in the foot. Here is a difference. It makes a difference apparent between the manner in which the Indian Hindu community integrates and works here, and in which the Pakistani and the Muslim community integrates and works here. You know, we have these notions. Somebody introduced the idea of a toxic minority. It was, I think, an Arab philosopher, and he identified that just by virtue of being a minority doesn't necessarily mean that you are a representative of divinity, and that most of history's problems have been caused by toxic minorities. The Nazis, when they started, were a toxic minority that nobody took seriously. And from the point of view of the indigenous Indians, the British, when they arrived on the island, they were certainly a toxic minority in terms of their impact upon India and indeed on the other colonial states. So this change it's drawing clear water between the way in which other minorities integrate and work here. We work as British citizens, and the British community here for a long time, and sometimes to the dissatisfaction of the Indian position, our position was it's for India and Pakistan to sort out. The British have no official position, nothing to contribute. That's totally different to the manner in which the Pakistani community in the United Kingdom have worked. So yes.
Let me interrupt you on this. Just one. You please add one more remark on my question. Would this not mean that both the Labour and the Conservatives will now compete for Hindu-Indian vote? Because the change in the British Labour Party has taken place because they have recognized that people like you organized the vote for the Conservative Party, and the Conservative Party's victory in many marginal seats was due to the Indian community, and particularly the Hindu community. So don't you think now you might be in a privileged position where both parties will now start trying to woo you?
For those who have political engagement and aspirations, I suspect calculations have been done on both sides. The Labour Party and indeed the Conservatives may well have come to this conclusion. But I have to say that the loyalty that the majority of us who work in this space have is to policies and is to the ideologies as opposed to party loyalty. And we try to engage with all parties on the issues that pose an existential threat to us in this country. It had become a security issue for us. The Labour Party, ideologically, was totally against us. And I think that having had an opportunity to reflect upon that ideological, dogmatic position, they've realized that wasn't the wise decision to make. So we've certainly had a move forward there. But I have to also say that the Conservative Party is still also very significantly influenced by those who I called British, as opposed to those who I called English. Now, one thing about Boris Johnson, which we have noticed, and it's actually quite refreshing. We had not had the experience of having a leader in place for a long period of time. We had an awful lot of committees, and the manner in which he approached his own party first and ejected people like Kenneth Clarke, who was the father of the House of Commons, such a long-standing politician. But because Boris Johnson didn't feel that he was contemporarily connected with the mood of the nation, he removed him. And this was such a shock to everybody. Winston Churchill's grandson, another member of the Conservative Party stalwart, again, removed him. And so Boris's approach is very much utilitarian and a contemporary one. And I think he is better connected to the mood of the nation than many of the political parties have been for a long time.
Did he not go to the Swami Narayan Mandir for seeking blessings for the election?
He did, and He was welcomed there. The Nizam Swaminarayan Mandir, which you also visited with us when you were visiting here, they have a pretty good track record now. Those who have visited them prior to election seem to have received their blessings and have been showered with success. Although they'll be the last to make this statement. But yes, he did. And I think this is the aspect that is resonating with the Indian community. We're actually quite pragmatic people, and we want to get the job done. We want things to improve for everybody. And Boris Johnson's cabinet, I think, reflects this. He has chosen a team who are good at the work they do, irrespective of their origin and indeed the degree of pigmentation that they support. So yes, the answer to your question is I think both parties have realized that India is a major influential power now. And as an economic power, it would be a completely foolish choice to say, no, we are going to dogmatically align ourselves with Pakistan, who we created just to be able to play our great game in South Asia, but it doesn't serve us anymore, at the expense of such an incredible opportunity. And the English people desperately want to have commercial, cultural, and spiritual relationships with India, as do the Irish, as do the Scottish, as do the Welsh. It's the British who have this stumbling block mentality yet, and we're doing our best to move them beyond that. So you're absolutely right. The political parties will be, I'm confident, aware of the manner in which the Hindu community came out. Not only did we engage, we actively set about to deconstruct the Labour Party if they pursued such an aggressive manner, campaigns against us. The Jewish community very successfully brought actions about anti-Semitism. And that was a hugely damaging issue for them. We have the same grounds to be able to say that the Labour Party is Hindu-odic. Hindu odium is a term that I'd like to see much more commonly bandied about, an irrational hatred of Hindus, and that is a part of the old Labour. So yes, these are all seismic shifts. The other comment that you made was with regard to Islamic militancy and the differences between the two. There is an increasing sense now that there is a group in this country whose interests are actually not aligned to the interests of the people of this island. That they are here with an agenda, a manifesto, which places a priority, the welfare of people outside of these islands, over and above the welfare of people within these islands. And that's something that I think the political powers will have to really come to terms with. They will have to remember that they are elected and paid for by the taxpayers of this country to, as a priority, look after the welfare of the natives of this country. And they're not there to grandstand and deem themselves to be members of some extraordinary race who are going to interfere in the affairs of all sorts of nations. So there's a bit of an education process going on there. And I think that's also becoming very, very clear.
Okay, Jagdish.
Does everybody agree with what I've said? In this case, though, we can all go and have dinner. But
okay, thank you, Satiji and Dr. Swami. With that, we come to the end of this episode of Gyan Ganga Words of Wisdom, and it was very kind of Pandit Satish Sharma ji to come.
No, it was a brilliant analysis. I don't think we have anybody in India has heard such a fine analysis of the British situation or English situation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Swamiji. This is the outcome of being in lockdown, you see. When you can't move out of the house, then one meditates a lot and ideas sort of come together, don't they? Thank you for your approval.
So with this, we come to the end of this episode, and we'll be back tomorrow at the same time, 8 p.m. Indian Standard Time, with another guest along with Dr. Swami. Tomorrow's guest is Mr. Ratan Sharda, who will be discussing with Dr. Swami on the issue of Hindutva. He is a Hindu ideologue and very popular on the TV shows. So we'll be back tomorrow at 8 p.m. on Gyan Ganga Words of Wisdom of the Virat Hindustan Sangam. Again, wanting to remind our viewers, because we still get a lot of information and messages, how do we join the organization of Dr. Swami Virat Hindustan Sangam? I have to tell our viewers that please visit our website of Virat Hindustan Sangam, which is www.vhsindia.org, and register yourself. www.vhsindia.org, and register yourself as members. We thank you for your cooperation, support, for the increasing viewership. We also apologize for some technical hitches we had at the start of the program. Perhaps our guest, Pandit Satish Sharma, wanted to do a presentation also, but there were a little bit hitches. So we apologize for the technical thing, because in these days of lockdown, certain things are beyond our control. So thank you, Dr. Swami, Satish Sharma.
Satish, everybody wants to know if you're on Twitter. You have to
Everybody?
unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself.
You are muted, Satish ji.
Yeah.
Hello, is that back? That's wonderful.
Yes.
Yes, indeed. I have moved into the Twitter space, and I can be contacted at the British Hindu, or indeed at Dharma Rising, a phrase which was coined when Dr. Swamiji first visited us in England in 2013.
So what Satish said was his Twitter handle is the British Hindu, at the British Hindu, or at Dharma Rising, as you can see on our screens, at the British Hindu and at Dharma Rising. Thank you everybody. Dhanyawad and Jai Hind.